It's recording now.
Cool. Thanks for inviting me. I'm getting over a cold, and so I probably sound a little stuffy, and I'll probably be going a bit slower than usual. So just bear with me. Hold on one second. Okay, cool. Yeah. So this talk is essentially on uh, the use of or this literature called algorithmic fairness, right? And so essentially, two criticisms of data science have recently emerged. The first one, kind of coming out of a recent book by Rua Benjamin, Race After Technology, which essentially says or argues that these seemingly objective learning algorithms often reinforce racist and otherwise unjust the unjust status quo. And so the idea here is that there's normative values that influence scientific practice. The second criticism emerges out of a recent trade book by Judea Pearl. It's mostly a methodological critique over how practitioners of data science and machine learning have wholesale failed to really develop a science or a formal apparatus to do causal inference, and have rather really focused on mere correlation techniques. And so really the first criticism throws into relief an urgent social problem, where the second seems like more of an internal methodological dispute. And so essentially what I'm be doing in this talk is really kind of trying to show how these two criticisms are actually deeply related. And so what I want to argue is that there can be no answer to the social justice critique until data science adopts more of a causal orientation. And so one of the first things I want to do is kind of just broadly set out like two pictures or views of scientific rationality. So like ways of viewing scientific practice. One that I'm going to characterize as like a militative approach, and then another approach more of an associative sort of approach. The militative approach, you can see early signs of it starting as far back as Francis Bacon. And so Bacon essentially argued that scientific rationality means to transform our existing social organization into one more compatible with demands of justice, liberty, and human flourishing. You also see this similar picture within the Africana tradition. So like out of a lot of early Africana sociologists and what I would call proto-data scientists like Ida B. Wells and Kelly Miller and Du Bois. And so these were all attempts to counter racist pseudoscientific practice and to promote social reform through the expert deployment of statistics. So Du Bois with early forms of data visualization, and Ida B. Wells, excuse me, with her red record. And so Du Bois in particular held that the aim of science was to change the nature and character of society. So for Du Bois, scientific inquiry had to explicitly include universal social goals of progress and reform. You also see this as well in John Dewey. So Dewey took this ambition to be a part of the very definition of logic. And he states, the problem of a logical theory is none other than the problem of the possibility of the development and employment of intelligent method and inquiries concerned with deliberate reconstruction of experience. And by reconstruction, Dewey did not mean any sort of post hoc rationalization, but rather deliberate action in order to change the nature of future experience, especially as it concerns our moral and political affairs. Now, we see a differing approach here, this contrasting approach that I mentioned earlier in Doom. And so in Doom, we see a flat out rejecting of trying to investigate true causes, but rather enters in what's, characterized saving the phenomena. So basically correctly predicting future phenomena without any pretense to understanding any sort of underlying causal mechanism that brought about the phenomena. And so, the worry is, at least when important to social science, this notion of prediction is broadly ambiguous. And here leads to a dilemma. Should social science aim only to predict social phenomena, given the current social structure that persists? Or is social science also responsible for predicting the results of attempts to restructure society? And so a distinction between the weak former and the strong latter sense of prediction does not naturally arise in something like astronomy, since we're usually not concerned with tinkering with organization of heavenly bodies. However, only a social science that can inform a structural reorganization of society could satisfy a meliorative approach similar to that of Dewey or Du Bois. One of the things I also want to get on the table, aside from these two notions of rationality, is that's going to reappear in the talk, is this notion of observational distribution. So this is something that data scientists are often study, and observational distribution is essentially a theoretical shorthand for the entire nexus population level of associations that attain between variables of interest in any particular locale. So, for example, it may encapsulate the population level, the population level nexus of associations between something like perceived race, gender, and origins, as well as education, legal, and economic outcomes. So, if you knew everything about the observational distribution, you would know what percentage of Black men graduate with bachelor's degrees and what percentage of are incarcerated within their lifetimes. But it's important to highlight you would not thereby know what policy interventions would eliminate the association between race and educational or incarceration outcomes, since many different causal mechanisms give rise to the same observational distribution. In other words, the meliorative approach requires information about an interventional distribution, where an interventional distribution is the nexus of associations that will be induced by a proposed policy treatment into the status quo. The next part of the talk I want to highlight is like essentially this sort of, insofar as I guess this is what I want to say, insofar as data scientists forswear inferences from the observational to the interventional distribution, they stand in an antagonistic relationship with causal inference. And Pearl, in his 2019 work that I referenced earlier, points out that this is not a new development, that this antagonism towards causation has been a feature of statistical methodology since its inception, starting with Carl Pearson. And so Carl Pearson is the founder of modern statistics, and he was very strong in really trying to discard with any sort of causal talk and replacing it entirely with talk of association. You see the quote there that I have highlighted. Interestingly enough, that same year, Pearson confuses matters by treating measures of statistical correlation and if they were measures of partial correlation, within his whole eugenics program. We see this same sort of kind of over-reliance on association sort of thinking across the Atlantic, where you had this German statistician, Friedrich Hoffmann, who had similar discussions about Black criminality that Pearson was arguing with eugenics. So in Hoffmann's Race, Trace, and the Tendencies of the American Negro, which includes nothing but gems, if the book is titled something like that, clearly it is making deep, cutting at the joints of the nature, conclusions about reality. But at any rate, in this book, it was a statistical analysis of Black health and criminality. And its effect was essentially to shape racial statistics in a powerful, full-blown narrative of Black self-destruction, racial decay, and essentially the futility of Negro reform. And so from high mortality rates among Blacks, Hoffman in his work basically concluded that the nation should not waste any resources on a vanishing race. However, interestingly enough, he gave a different interpretation of the high mortality rate among whites. In their case, he of course blamed society and called for economic interventions. But the lesson here, I guess, I suppose I want to draw out from these two examples is that racist societies will inevitably produce many easily observable correlations between health, criminality, and race. And in absence of a methodology for systematically investigating the causes of those associations, unexamined prejudice will often just fill in the gaps. And, I'm not going to have time to go into here, but, Du Bois and Kelly Miller had a very good response to Friedrich Hoffman in this work, basically calling into question his statistical method and, making the sort of general claim I'm making here of like not a focus on causal analysis and just kind of over relying on associations. Of course, within statistics are taught to be on guard against glibly inferring causes from correlations. Generally this is the takeaway from any basic course someone takes on statistics. However, often such experiments for causal interventions are typically not only immoral or infeasible. You can't randomly assign Black children to be raised in different societies where certain structural features have been surgically altered to remain identical. And this difficulty raises two fundamentally different programs. So mainstream statistics responds to this difficulty by basically saying what Doom did. Like, look, since you can't hope to eliminate all the relevant underdetermination without recourse to experiments, you ought not to say much about the effects of structural interventions. After all, the observational distribution I was saying earlier could give rise to a variety, could be created a variety of different ways. The best you could basically hope for, at least would be argued a lot of times, is some natural experiment. If you're lucky, approximate the experimental conditions with some degree of acceptability. However, this kind of ignores some of the literature in causal inference. So some of the work done by Judea Pearl and Sperdes and Gleedmore out of Carnegie Mellon. And this approach just responds differently. While acknowledging that some underdetermination does persist, it studies the exact extent in which the interventional distribution is underdetermined by the observational. And the overwhelming work on causal inference in this context explores this. And so the point here is that this does not eliminate the need for experiments, but it does serve to reduce the amount of underdetermination in social scientific settings, which can serve as a rational guide for this sort of meliorative approach I was characterizing earlier. But within data science, to a large extent, they've been fairly indifferent about this sort of causal approach. One does not have to know how to change or explain associations that persist under the status quo in order to exploit them for predictive or commercial purposes. So essentially the thinking here is that data scientific rationality is not interested in structurally reorganizing society, but it enables sophisticated actors to exploit associations that persist under the current regime. And of course, widespread use of predictive algorithms does change the game, since it does represent a dramatic social intervention. And insofar as it raises the probability that the widespread implementation of predictive algorithms trained on the observational distribution persisting under status quo may undermine itself by changing the distribution under which it itself is trained. But although, this is often done in like a very haphazard and untheorized fashion, systematic use of these algorithms, at least I want to argue in the rest of this talk, typically reinforces the distribution persisting under the current status quo. And these algorithms are often very much so self-verifying, because the predictions tend to be self-fulfilling. And an example of that I want to show, and I'm going to talk about next, is predictive policing and risk assessments. So in 2016, ProPublica published an investigative document showing the use of risk assessment algorithms in all stages of the criminal justice process. And basically, they were claiming to predict the likelihood of things like a defendant reoffending, and the algorithm would generate risk assessment scores and enter these decisions about like pretrial detention or sentencing or parole. And what these investigators discovered is a significant number of disparities between white and Black defendants. And so Black defendants were not only more likely to be classified as high risk, they were also more likely to be incorrectly classified as high risk. And so the algorithm falsely flagged Black defendants as future criminals at almost twice the rate it made the same mistake for white defendants. And moreover, white defendants were more often incorrectly flagged as low risk than Black defendants. And so this obviously provoked significant response from the data scientist community. And many argued that the racial disparities were unfortunate, but an inevitable price to pay for predictive accuracy. And despite the flurry of theoretical activity, the data scientific response displayed, I will argue, a lack of curiosity in the interest of the causes of the disparities in the base rates of crime evident in the training data. After all, the data did not record the rates in which Black and white defendants recommitted crimes or violate the terms of their parole. They record only the frequency in which they're rearrested by the police or found to be in violation by parole officers. And so, the disparities may arise certainly because Blacks are more likely to be reoffend, or because it could be because they're held to a higher standard of conduct by their parole officers and their communities are more aggressively policed. How can a risk assessment algorithm be considered fair if these sort of basic causal questions are not addressed in the design? And at this point, maybe, our imaginary data scientist interlocutor might protest and say, look, I was tasked with estimating the likelihood of rearrest. That's what I've done. It is the responsibility of lawmakers and jurists to address the inequalities of society. My business here is strictly prediction. And as long as the associations existing in the current organization of society persists, I can't do anything but predict otherwise. But the worry with this sort of response that I at least in my experience, I come across as fairly prevalent within this community is that our imagined data scientist speaks as if they're just a mere passive observer. When a risk assessment algorithm becomes ubiquitous in criminal justice settings, the algorithms are no longer merely reflecting unjust society. They become part of the very structure of that social injustice. So I just don't know what to make of that sort of claim. One of the papers that came out for this that I wanted to talk about, I thought was like very interesting, was actually by Kristen Loom, who's here at Penn actually, and what she argued here, I'll read it because I actually think that this was very insightful, and what I'm going to argue is that I think something actually stronger is going on here. She basically says, look, because this data is collected as a byproduct of police activity, predictions made on the basis of patterns learned from this data do not pertain to future instances of crime on whole. They pertain to future instances of crime that becomes known to police. In this sense, predictive policing is aptly named. It is future predicting, not future crime. To make matters worse, the presence of bias in the initial training data can be further compounded as police departments use biased predictions to make tactical policing decisions, because these predictions are likely to overrepresent areas that were already known to police. Officers become increasingly likely to parole these same areas and observe new criminal acts that confirm their prior beliefs regarding the distributions of criminal activity. The newly observed criminal acts that the police document as a result of these targeted patrols feed into predictive policing algorithms on subsequent days, generating increasingly biased predictions. This creates a feedback loop where the model becomes increasingly confident that the locations most likely to experience further criminal activities are exactly the locations they previously believed to be high in crime. So this is, their argument is an example of selection bias and confirmation bias. I would actually argue that there's something potentially stronger. So the interaction of a risk assessment algorithm with a predictive policing algorithm creates even more of a perverse feedback loop, because the risk assessment algorithms predict that Black arrestees are more likely to be arrested. And these algorithms are trained on data generated by police activity, informed or directed by predictive policing algorithms, which predictably over-police these Black neighborhoods, right? That's his argument, right? Thus, the risk assessment algorithms make prophecies that are fulfilled by the predictive policing algorithms. But it's easy to imagine how the influence can flow in the other direction. So what I mean by this is that risk assessment algorithms may release Black defendants under stricter conditions of supervision, electronic surveillance, and these defendants will be more likely to enter into the training data of predictive policing algorithms, thus exacerbating the selection bias. And so the two groups of data science, equally convinced that they are merely making predictions, may inadvertently collude with each other and the police to ensure that the predictions come true. And for their part, the police are reassured by, of course, the scientific objectivity of their methods, right? And so at every stage, the process is albeit a form of pseudo rationality that, in its hurry to exploit statistical associations for these predictive purposes, fails to interrogate how these associations arose and whether society stands to benefit by perpetuating them. And most of all, this form of pseudo-scientific rationality excuses itself, right, from any considerations of the systemic consequences of its own ubiquity. Kind of drawing to a closure in our discussion, the second point, the last thing I want to bring up here is like, okay, so what is going on here? I'm a philosopher, so I'm interested in like the more general issue at play here, you know? And so what I think is going on, which is a part of this larger narrative I'm running of like steering our focus away from causation, I think many of the issues arising in the literature on algorithmic fairness essentially arose decades earlier in the context of psychometrics. However, the insights of this older literature have been largely neglected. Psychometry is a mature field, and obviously it has many of its own problems and controversies, But I think the primary advantage over the work, its primary advantage over the work in machine learning is that it's conscientiously conceives of its task as involving inference about latent features of an individual, not merely predictions about future course of individuals' lives. So I take that to be a causal concern, right? And so what I'm going to argue in this last section is that I think that a richer conceptual structure that allows for distinctions to be articulated or that are missing from machine learning are found in this literature in psychometrics, and it can kind of help us elucidate the machine learning literature and algorithmic fairness. Okay, so what's the issue then? So any of you know anything about psychometrics, the fundamental problem is often to infer latence, okay? And so now I'm a philosopher, so now I'm gonna be introducing a whole bunch of notation. So, just bear with me, but I'm gonna tease out the intuitive thing, but, I wanna be a bit more precise now, okay? So the fundamental problem of, like I said, psychometrics refer a latent unobservable feature L of an individual on the basis of some observed score, call it S, right? And this is derived from a set of observable variables, right? And so the latent variable L might be something like intelligence, or it might be danger posed to community, but the score might be a result of something like an IQ test or a written exam, or it could be computed from demographic information and official records. And so the applications that me and my collaborator have in mind here is that the observed score S is used to make some sort of consequential decision. In typical applications, there's also some initial single threshold T, such that everyone scoring above the threshold gets this desirable outcome, such as something like admission to grammar school or parole. And ideally, most everyone above this particular threshold T is also above a latent threshold, we call it T star. So i.e. this might be scoring high enough on a particular test, ensures that with high probability, you're sufficiently intelligent, for a mission, or you're sufficiently law-abiding to be released from prison. And in interesting applications, there's also, and this specific language is used actually within the machine learning literature, some sensitive variable R, normally standing for a demographic category like race or gender. And finally, there's some contextually relevant outcome O, which would be observed in the future. So for example, O might be something like the GPA at a school, so expected GPA, or it might be a binary variable, including whether or not a prisoner will be rearrested after their release. And so what this literature has done is made two distinctions to capture this, right? One of them is called measurement invariance. The other one is called predictive invariance. And what I'll do is I'll briefly introduce these concepts and then conclude. So what's measurement invariance, right? So measurement invariance basically requires that conditional on the score S, that the sensitive variable R is not information about the latent L. So for example, this principle required that two individuals with the same score on an intelligence test are expected to have the same level of intelligence regardless of race. And so right there, that below, I have a formal, like how I think this should be represented mathematically, but the basic intuition is something like this. So imagine the risk assessment setting we were reflecting on earlier. So it will require that two individuals of the same risk, basically, two individuals of the same risk score pose the same level of danger to their community. So a failure of measurement invariance would mean that test scores are not directly comparable across values of sensitive variables. So a score of a 75 might mean danger to community for blacks, but not whites, right? So you can imagine it's like equal weights and balances or something like that, if you want like an intuitive idea. Predictive invariance essentially requires that conditional on the score S, the sensitive variable R is not informative about some future observable outcome. And so the intuition here, for example, this principle would basically require that two individuals of the same score on something like an IQ test are expected to have the same GPA in school, irrespective of race. And so in the risk assessment setting, it would look like two individuals with the same risk score have the same probability of being rearrested after release. And a failure of predictive invariance means that individuals do not have the same future outcomes across values of sensitive variables. So a 75 might mean likely to be rearrested for a black inmate, but not for a white inmate. And it's also to point out too that if you look carefully at the way that this is characterized, that this will be true. This score basically explicitly encodes race as a predictor of O. And so basically, the more biased the score is in this respect, the better you will satisfy your criteria. And so in a series of mathematical papers, statistician Millsap argued that these two concepts, measurement invariance and predictive invariance, while individually satisfiable, are typically incompatible. And so if a test satisfies one principle, it typically won't satisfy the other. And so although Millsap proves mathematically for various reasons the precise expressions of both equations, the context of the results is intuitive enough for the purposes here. So let me just motivate a case to kind of highlight it. So basically, suppose that an IQ test satisfies measurement invariance, okay? So in other words, two individuals of different races have equal test scores. Then with a high probability, they should be roughly equally intelligent. However, the issue is in a racist society, equal intelligence of students of different races would not be expected to have equal outcomes, right? In a society, Black students face a headwind of economic hardship and social discrimination unrelated to their intelligence. And so equal test scores would not predict equal GPAs for students of different races. Therefore, in this case, predictive invariance would fail. Suppose conversely that IQ test satisfies predictive invariance. then equal test scores predict GPA regardless of race. However, in a racist society, different races with equal GPAs would not be expected to be of equal intelligence. So to achieve the same performance as whites, blacks would presumably have to compensate for the racist headwind with, more being more clever in resources and the like. So given equal tests, you would have given the equal test scores, we would not infer equal intelligence for the students of different races. And so you would have measurement and variance failing in this case. What's the application in the risk assessment? So suppose that you have an algorithm, okay? And this algorithm is assigning risk scores satisfied by, so this algorithm is assigning risk scores satisfies measurement and variance. Then if two individuals of different races have the same score, they roughly pose equal danger to their communities. However, in a racist society, people of different races who pose equal threats to the community do not receive the same treatment by the police. In such a society, black parolees are more likely to be rearrested by than white parolees. And for reasons that we have already discussed, they do not they do not essentially do the same danger and pose the same danger to the community. So given equal risk scores, we would not expect equal probabilities of rearrest. Therefore, you would have predictive and variance failing in this case. Conversely, suppose the algorithm satisfies predictive invariance. Then the two individuals of different races have same risk scores. They have roughly equal probabilities of being rearrested, but for all the same reasons as before, the two individuals of different races have equal probabilities of being rearrested, do not pose equal stress to the community, and so you have measurement and variance failing. So the point here is to show basically that like these two notions are really incompatible, and to really seal the deal, consider this case as a bit more exaggerated, but it's to make a conceptual point so we really walk away at least with an understanding of these ideas. So suppose that grammar school admissions decided on the decided by scores on a mission test that satisfies predictive invariance, okay? Suppose that the decision is procedurally equal, okay? So everyone with an expected GPA of 3.0 or above is omitted. Okay, finally, suppose that the grammar schools are so cartoonishly racist that after admissions, black students get a full grade automatically deducted from their exam. Okay, so the black student with the expected GPA of 2.5 would be given an expected with an expected GPA of 2.5 would have, if it was not a racist institution, expected GPA of 3.5. And so the predictive invariance basically requires that two students with equal expected GPAs receive the same score on the admission test regardless of race. And so procedural invariance requires that the two students with the equal expected GPAs receive the same admission decisions. And so black students with an expected GPA of a 2.5 must receive the same decision as a white student with an expected GPA as a 2.5. In this scenario, predictive invariance and procedural equality are basically working together to make a mockery of justice. They penalize the black students not for their innate abilities, but for the racist grading policy of the grammar schools. And so although this example is rather stylized, you can consider it whenever it's applied to observable future outcomes that don't reflect the actual value of latent variables, okay, because of societal bias. So for example, we know that blacks and whites do not receive equal treatment by the police or by parole officers. Predictive invariance will require us to give higher risk scores to black prisoners, not because they're more dangerous, but because they're more likely to be unfairly targeted or held to higher standards by parole officers. And so given this, I think obviously, the line I've been running here, I think you should target measurement invariance. It's something that's supposed to be representing latent variable inference of the actual causal factors at play. And so what's going on here in the algorithmic, what I'm calling unfairness literature, is basically under procedural equality and predictive invariance, any further talk of fairness, in my opinion, just a mockery of the term. So for people in this literature to talk about fair decisions, really to me seems to presuppose that there's something like individual merit, which is not directly observable, but to which a fair decision must be responsive. So to identify mutual individual merit would expect that, hold up, I think I got some chat thing here. And I'm running out on time here. So actually, let me kind of wrap this up. So yeah, so so what I want to say here. So so my argument I got thrown. Okay, so so the idea here, let me kind of close this up. So in the machine learning fairness, it's not possible to articulate this distinction I'm making, right? And this is because machine learning is concerned with involving only prediction of future outcomes and not inferences about latent variables and individuals. Since practitioners cannot express measurement and variance in their formalism, they cannot design algorithms that satisfy it. And so the thing I want to close with here is basically, I'll just kind of summarize this. So basically the way that fairness is talked about in machine learning is essentially fairness means that a person, and what Joseph is arguing here is that fairness means that a less qualified applicant will never be preferred more than a qualified applicant. So more qualified in this context simply just means higher expected payout, which is to say, like, the loan is expected to be more profitable and the employee is expected to make more sales, or the student is expected to make a higher grade. And so the algorithm proceeds by estimating this expected payout of each applicant, and by selecting those maximum expected payouts, it's basically merely focused on predictive invariance, this concept we were talking about earlier. And my argument is, obviously I was just making, if you're focused on that, then you're gonna miss out on this latent stuff. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion here is that, like, look, a rational social science would enable us to at least reason carefully about the kinds of information we need to identify which systemic features of society are unfair and how they can be changed. And it will provide us with the structure to our reasoning about how to fairly appropriate and reappropriate resources. And what I've been trying to at least gesture at here is that reflection upon all these goals require the right sort of causal knowledge, right? And so basically what sort of choices or events brought about our current situation, what features of society are the causes of others. And it's been the aim of this talk to establish a sort of standard, I guess is the challenge, the sort of standard data scientific methodology as not being up to this urgent task, and establish more of a causal approach, which I think would be our best hope to getting some headway towards this. So that's the talk.
Thank you, Alex. That was a lot, and it was also very enlightening to actually see how these kinds of, the kind of conversation around algorithmic fairness, algorithmic bias can be seen with more clarity. Usually, whenever I hear algorithmic fairness, I just hear algorithmic fairness is bad, but there is never a why or how. So I really appreciate your talk. So this is a workshop, and we have 19 minutes left. So what we're going to do is we're going to just give 3 minutes to the question in the chat, and then we're going to break out into breakout rooms to have our own individual discussion. We're going to try to make them relatively smaller breakout rooms, since we do have a lot of people. It's still a lot, but that'll be for about 8 minutes. And then we'll come back together with, energized with our own discussion, and ask any follow-up questions or make any follow-up comments, and then close by the end of the hour. So with this, I'll just quickly read the question in the chat. And I really do recommend everyone get ready their questions for discussion during breakout rooms and after. So Jania asks, from the data science perspective, there are often blanket statements made about the algorithm, which negatively impact Black communities. In reality, a mosaic of frameworks, statistical methodologies, even ways that we calculate and quantify wrong or right predictions are at play in machine learning, and sometimes I fear is at risk for being too generalized in lay vocabulary. What is your advice for how we might collectively shift the paradigm from the algorithm as the perpetrator to data scientist behind the model? And in parentheses, it says, how might measurement / predictive invariance play a role in how internalized discourse is communicated? So just spend a little bit of time, please, trying to answer that.
Yeah, so, I might ask for some clarification from the person who asked the question. So the first part of the question is kind of like is it that we have this sort of very loose discourse and that leads to people talking very imprecisely about the precise tools that are being used and the exact ways in which the tools may be like methodologically flawed for whatever reasons, and not only methodologically flawed, but like I mentioned earlier, maybe like the sort of normative assumptions that may be embedded within even the use of the tools. So I guess what I want to say maybe about that, if that's the worry, I'll say I think, what I was arguing with the measurement and predictive invariance thing is that it at least gives us a language to talk about latent variable inference, right? And that's like a sort of causal question. And I think that would be very useful in making the sort of assumptions, about what's going into these models and the extent of what they can do and predict, useful. I think the other bit about, shifting it from the algorithm to the data science, I was making in some of this methodological critiques that are kind of irrespective of, somebody's normative values. Like that argument I was making about like just sampling bias, that's not really, that's just about your method, really. That's not more so about like, what beliefs you necessarily have about Black people or whatever. I'm just saying, like, if you want to tell me, and really the general argument I've been making is just like a methodological argument. I'm saying, like, if you want to tell me stuff about like counterfactual questions, you can do that without like doing interventions, like without doing causal inference, right? That is like a methodological criticism, And so I'm saying, like, if we care about like fairness, which I understand it to be like changing unjust status quos, you have to address this causal counterfactual question, so that's not even, so I don't know if like shifting the discourse to like, away from the algorithm to the data scientist is necessarily helpful. I'm focusing on like, no, like data science, like the method is of just like doing associations is trash, and so I don't know if that's helpful or whatever, but the person can ask a follow-up,
Yeah, thanks, Alex. You can go for it, Jania.
I was just saying that was helpful.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad it helped.
Great. So I'm going to create several rooms, and I'm just gonna check them out. All right, so great. So I'm going to start the breakout rooms, and feel free to have a discussion. I will give you a 1 minute warning, and yeah, have at it.